Hello. In this episode, I interviewed Rebecca Scott. She's a professor at Harper College in Chicago. Rebecca used Dungeons and Dragons to teach a course on ethics. We talked a lot about this, but we also talked a bit about other games to teach philosophy, such as argumentative maps to teach critical thinking, and also redesigning classic tabletop games in light of a certain philosophical theory. Using Dungeons and Dragons to teach ethics is such a spectacular idea. I am sure you enjoy listening to this interview.
I'm Rebecca Scott. I teach philosophy at Harper College in the suburbs of Chicago. It's a community college. And I really like teaching using games and playful pedagogies.
Nice. Yeah, it's this thing, right, about playful. Russell Marcus he taught a lot about this. So I know already from you using Dungeons and Dragons because I read that incredible post, and I want to talk more about it as well. So the question is, so what games have you used in teaching? So you use the Dungeons and Dragons. Talk about it. How do you use Dungeons and Dragons? Because that's super interesting, and also any other games as well.
Yeah, it started off using Dungeons and Dragons, more specifically D&D, but now I kind of have a sort of loosely D&D inspired RPG that I use, so I don't really use many of the rules from D&D anymore. I kind of use the character creation and then sort of do my own thing for the rules. So I use that in my ethics classes. So we read a bunch of different philosophers throughout the semester, and then at the end, for the last like month or so of class, like 4 or 5 weeks, students create characters based on the philosophers that we've read, the ethical theories that they've learned about. And then we play a role-playing game where they make choices in the game, inspired by the different ethical theories. And then we kind of, go from there. So that's the quick version of the D&D game, or D&D inspired game. And then I also just have over time just come to use a lot of different games. So I've used I do argument mapping games in my critical thinking classes. And then I also just like to do games like pub style trivia review games, or like just any kind of just basically turning the classroom into a playful space, I've found is really helpful. And you can kind of turn anything into a game if you suddenly just say, okay, these are your groups, pick a team name, and now we have points, and now you're trying to win, and then it becomes a game, sort of whatever we're doing. So I kind of try to include that sort of playful spirit into a lot of the activities that we do in class, whether or not they're officially games or not. um yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if they're actually games, right? How to define games and all these things. But beyond that, I think the key thing is being playful, right? Is there's playfulness in teaching, and also just games. You mentioned argumentative maps in critical thinking. What is this?
Yeah, there's a movement recently to use argument mapping or argument diagramming in teaching critical thinking, rather than just putting arguments in standard premise conclusion form, as a way of better representing the structure of arguments. And so the website Thinker Analytics also has some templates for this. So the games that I do are kind of similar to that, to what Thinker Analytics does. But basically, I have claims printed out on pieces of paper, and then templates of argument maps. And then students have to try to put the claims, so they have to identify the conclusion and then figure out, where the claims fit into the argument map. So it helps them to understand what it means for one claim to provide support for another claim, because that's actually something that I found, that when you really slow down and ask students to understand that concept, it's actually something that you need to spend more time on than you think you do in teaching. And so I found that doing these argument maps is a really good way of slowing down the process of teaching argumentation, and helping students to understand the relationship between claims.
And does it work? I mean, how is the outcome? How do you feel? Do they really learn? Do they like it? What's the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think, teaching argument mapping, teaching critical thinking, I'll be honest, not like my favorite thing to teach, like, but I like preferred, dealing with, ethics and thinking about, playing D&D and that sort of thing. But I do actually find that it's really helpful in a few ways. So I think that one of the things I've realized is that I was sort of assuming that students understood and knew things that they didn't. And playing the game actually helped me to see, oh, they don't actually understand. Like if I give them two claims and one claim is a reason for the other claim, like sometimes they don't know which claim is the reason and which claim is the like conclusion, like they don't understand that relationship. So it helped me to kind of have, sort of right and wrong answers in a sense, because often I think in philosophy we don't have like very clear cut, I mean, obviously there's better and worse interpretations and blah 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 and more or less justified, but really being able to say like, no, this claim is not the reason for this claim, it's the other way around. Like it helped me to see what students understood and didn't understand. And the context of the game helped students to not feel as bad when they made mistakes, which I think is really the power of a lot of the game-based learning and the playful attitude is, in a game, you're like, oh man, I didn't get that point, like next time. Whereas if you do a homework assignment and you get a bad grade on it, you're like, I'm a failure, I'm not good at this. So I find that like having the context of a game helps me to give critical feedback to students in a way that is really like less threatening, and they're able to take it in stride more. So I find that it is really effective.
Yeah, that what you said is great. This thing about, because failure is something that it's okay in a game. We fail all the time. Those are games are like this, right?
So it would be a really boring game if you never fail. Like if you never died in a video game, you'd be like, that game was too easy. You wouldn't want to play it. You know?
There's even that problem of paradox of failure. Why do we keep playing if we fail all the time? But that's the whole point. That whole point. But so what about the Dungeons and Dragons? How was the outcome? I mean, because I'm unbelievably interested in that one. So how was the outcome of using RPG to teach ethics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what it was really useful for in some ways was like reviewing and consolidating what students had already learned. And so in one sense, what they're doing is they're applying the theory to specific situations, which is a kind of higher level, task to ask students to do. So it's one thing to say like, what is the categorical imperative? And they can like tell it back to you. And you can say like, why does Kant think lying is wrong? And they can tell you what you said or whatever. But the ability to apply it in a novel situation is like a different level of academic skill. And so I think in one sense it serves that purpose of just applying the philosophical theories in a really fun way. But I also and I think the other thing that's really interesting is the interplay between the different theories that comes up, because you have these different people representing different philosophers or different, frameworks. And then they have to actually encounter each other and they're in a situation together. And then they realize like, oh, the Beauvoir character and the Kant character, like actually maybe surprisingly do agree about some things, but then also really don't agree about other things. And so you kind of get that interconnection between the different philosophical views. Whereas a lot of times when you're teaching ethics, you're like, okay, we're done with Aristotle. Now we're doing Mill or whatever. And you might ask some questions of comparison, but you don't get that like real, confrontation of the perspectives where they have to like make a decision together. So I think that's that is another thing that is accomplished through it. And I think also the like creating the person that is inspired by the ethical theory. I actually think the character creation process is probably one of the most like actually, beneficial activities, because I asked them to think about like what experiences might someone have had that would lead them to become a existentialist, or what kind of a childhood would you have to be a Kantian or whatever. So like so they have to think through the kind of like it helps to embed the theories in a life and in a context and a narrative that I think is really helpful for yeah, like having a deeper understanding and connecting those theories like to their own lives, which for me is the ultimate goal. Like I don't actually really care if they know, you know, the different forms of the categorical imperative. You know, they're not going to remember that anyway. So like, you know, 5 years in the future, like they're not going to remember that. So, but what they hopefully can take away long term from the class is this kind of like self reflection about their decisions and their life and that kind of thing. And so I hope, it's hard to measure these things, but like my sense is that this helps to kind of concretize in a fun, more authentic way the different theories.
So how do you do you so you get them I don't know how big is the class, let's say 10 students, you put like 5 to do one character and 5 to the other, and then collectively they make the character.
Yeah, so I do. So I have my classes are like 25 to 30 students usually, and we read 6 different philosophers throughout the semester. So I have 6 groups of, you know, 4 or 5 students in each group, and then they create the character together, and then they have one representative from the group actually plays the game. And so it's like fishbowl style. So we have like, we're all sitting at the table in the middle, and then everybody else is on the outside of the circle watching. And I have observation sheets that the students who are not actively playing use. So they track like what decisions were made and what justifications were given for the decisions. And then they reflect at the end, like, which decisions like most were, you know, best fit the ethical framework, and which ones do you think you didn't quite fit the framework, and what do you think could have been done differently? So everybody is doing something, but only one student from each group is like playing the game. And then I don't force anyone to play, because some people are like, oh no, like I don't want to do that, you know. But usually there's at least one, you know, one person is enthusiastic in each group, and you can kind of, when you make the groups, like I ask for their preferences, but then I make the groups to kind of make sure that there's a balance of different personalities and things in the groups as well. Um, so everybody has a chance to play, but nobody is required to play.
Yeah, I think that answered the question that I was going to ask. One possible negative aspect is that especially Dungeons and Dragons can be very complex, but even if you make it easier, even if you make like a very simple tabletop RPG, I wonder, some people might think it's too hard on them. But since you don't make everyone play, right? It's like it's just one representative, so that overcomes, I believe. Or do you think that there was some negative aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think with any kind of learning activity, there's always going to be like some students that it resonates better with than others, and I don't think that's like a thing. I don't think you can avoid having activities that are going to speak more to some students than others. And so I think like sometimes yeah, I think there are some students that like really take to it. And what's fun is sometimes the students that really take to it are not the students that necessarily would have been super engaged in the more traditional academic setting. So I see it as a way of kind of increasing the inclusivity of the teaching by giving students with different interests and skills the opportunity to kind of showcase those. So I think, yeah, so yeah, there are some students who are hesitant, who are not quite as into it maybe as others, but I haven't found, because I don't force anybody to do it, I haven't like encountered any sort of deep resistance or hatred of it or anything like that. And like I was saying, I think that we have to I think whenever we want to try something that's different or experimental in teaching, we have this tendency to think that like that's the risky thing, and that that the status quo is somehow like good. And that like there aren't students that are being alienated or harmed or not disengaged, right, from like traditional learning activities, but that's like obviously not the case. So I think that like when we think about trying out these kind of like wacky ideas or whatever, it's important to, I mean, obviously we want to be mindful and think about the potential problems, of course, but I think like we also have to think about like the harms and the problems of the status quo, and it's worth it to experiment and try new things sometimes, because yeah, it's not like we're already doing a perfect job and everyone is learning everything all the time and is super engaged, you know?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, why do we start from the presupposition, right? And then like ever think, oh, things are good or things are not good. It's not like it's... So
Yeah.
I have a question. Where did you get the idea of using Dungeons and Dragons? Like I never thought of that.
Well, I mean, it's a few things. So one is like I was really lucky that like early in my very first exposure to thinking about teaching, I was teaching in a summer program at Elon University, and I was working with professor there, Stephen Block Schulman, who's like an extremely like creative teacher, like someone who thinks really creatively and deeply about teaching. And so my first introduction to teaching was of someone who like was not the norm at all. Like from the very beginning, he kind of taught me to think like, what are the goals and like what kind of experiences might students need to have in order to achieve those goals? And like that's very different from thinking like, oh, here's what you do in a class. You assign a paper, you would do this. Like, so I think from the very beginning of my thinking about teaching, I had a really good mentor who really thought outside the box. And so I've kind of, I think, benefited from that I've always sort of been like, well, what if, I don't know, you could have students like draw the text instead of paraphrasing it into words, or like, what if we just, had class like while walking around campus or whatever, I mean, those are not the best examples, but this idea of like just thinking like you don't have to just sit and like you don't have to just be like lecture, read, discuss, repeat, write a paper, repeat, like that you can have students do anything, I mean, within ethical boundaries, right? And so, yeah, so I think that's part of it. So that's where like my framework for thinking about teaching, I think, was really influenced by him, by Stephen, and my like early experiences with being mentored. But then specifically D&D, I didn't start playing until I was in grad school, and when 5th edition came out was when I first played. And it was like, just as soon as I played, I was like, I love this. Like, this is the best thing ever. And like, and I also realized, I think I mentioned this in the blog post a little bit, but like, I realized too that like the relationship between the dungeon master and the players is a really, really interesting one, I think, to me, that has so many parallels between like teacher and student. You are kind of in charge, things that the dungeon master knows, things that the players don't know, and that's important. You're responsible for making sure everybody feels safe, everybody's having a good time, for keeping things on pace, whatever, the timing, the rhythm of things. But ultimately, you're not solely in control. Fundamentally, you're co-creating with the players. And I think that that's exactly what teaching is at its best. And so to me, like, as soon as I started playing D&D, I was just like, this is what I want my classes to feel like, is this kind of directed but co-created experience. Like structured, there's rules, there's guidelines, there's someone in charge, which is really important, I think. But it's not, but yeah, it's like legitimately like a co-constructed experience. And so to me, it just like, from the first time I played, I was like, I want to make a class that is a campaign, like that is a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I've never done it for the whole class. Hopefully I will, but like, but yeah, so I think to me, just those parallels between the dungeon master and the players and the teacher and the students were like very apparent to me when I first started playing.
Oh, yeah, that's I never thought of that. Oh, there is some relation there, and going through the experience. And so, do you make, for instance, I can think if you're someone playing with a Kantian character, it will be a paladin, right? So do you get them to do the combats? Do you get them to do like the classic Dungeons and Dragons things?
So The game actually, we never get very far because, like, I mean, as anyone who's played Dungeons and Dragons, like, it takes a long, 4 hours. The first time you play, you're like, we're gonna play for 4 hours. That feels like forever, and then you do like one thing, like in 4 hours or whatever. So, having the 75-minute class sessions, I do it for 4 weeks plus 1 week of character creation. So, we have 8 sessions, 75-minute sessions. This is really not very much time in D&D world. So, we maybe make one or two decisions per class session. So I usually have at least one, I do at least one combat. Just a really simple, like, you're walking down the road and you get ambushed by goblins type thing. And what's interesting, because there's certain ethical decisions that come up through that. So in particular, okay, your friend just got shot with an arrow. Do you like attack the goblin or do you heal your friend? Like, what would a utilitarian do? Or, whatever. And then of course, at some point the goblins try to run away. And then it's like, do you pursue them or do you let them go? And, so there's always, so I feel like there's a couple of key decision points within a combat that are really helpful for drawing out the ethical theories. But usually we only have time to really have like one real combat, sometimes two.
Yeah, and especially because it's philosophy, right? And I don't know, the picture comes to my mind is there's the sketch from Monty Python of philosophers playing football, and they don't get to play the football. And I'm thinking
Right.
here of putting like Simone Beauvoir and Kant talking about like what we should do. They would just discuss eternally before doing
Right.
something. Yeah,
I mean, and the students don't always discuss as much as the philosophers would, but but the goal is to think through the issue. So I really don't try to move the story along too quickly. Like, obviously I want to like encourage the discussion and so, and stop and like get everybody's perspective. So really we don't get very far at all, which is always what happens in D&D. You think you're going to do a one shot and then it's like, it never, it always
but
takes
I think
longer
it can
than
be
you
really
think.
nice because of this specific encounter. In your blog post, you mentioned like the students, they create a Kantian character, and he goes into the cave, and they decided to announce himself in front of the cave, which is absurd. But it's I think it's very valuable. For me, when I play Dungeons and Dragons, it was these specific moments of interaction that would stick to my mind. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite moments. Yeah, and just like in case people haven't read it, there's a character playing a Kantian, and they got ambushed by the goblins, and then they decided they wanted to go like follow the goblins and see where they whatever. So they ended up going to the goblin cave, and they were going to sneak in, but the Kantian character decided that being stealthy was deceptive, and so he announced the presence of the party to the cave, and everybody laughed. And I think like that's the other thing I forgot to mention. I think the shared humor is also a way of reinforcing the knowledge, because it's like at the beginning of the semester, no one would have gotten a Kant joke, right? But by the end of the semester, when that student does that and everybody laughs because everybody's in on it, everybody gets it. And it's this way of like kind of reinforcing like, oh yeah, we did that. Like, we read Kant and it was really hard and now we understand it. And like, and there's this sense of community that's created through that like insider shared knowledge that really is like D&D or RPGs in general, have this tendency to create these funny moments. Their humor is like a really big part of a lot of role-playing games, I think. And that humor is very valuable, I think, for like reinforcing the learning and the community.
Yeah, when I was learning English, I had a teacher who said that if you can laugh of jokes and make jokes in English, it's because you're understanding English. And I'm thinking you said about Kant. The moment you can make jokes and get the jokes and laugh about it, that means that you're really like understanding it, or you're like at a nicer level. Also, I mean, you can make jokes about it, and that's quite nice. You finish so that your text. Why I use Dungeons and Dragons to play to teach ethics. You finish by talking about how fun should not just be a means to an end. Should not just be like, okay, let's have something fun so that students can write an essay about Kant, but also the end itself. And I couldn't agree more. I think this is so good. If you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I've been thinking a lot about, learning outcomes in teaching. And I think like there's, the way that teachers are trained to think is like start by thinking about the learning outcomes, like what do you hope students will accomplish, and then what do you, need them to do to get there. And I think that's very a useful framework. And I think that it's important to be like, why am I teaching this class? What are my goals? Like, obviously that's important. But I also think that there's like, if all we're doing is just, if we think of the experience of ourselves and students together in the classroom solely as like, in this instrumental way of trying to achieve, these ends, that we miss like the value of the community of the classroom as itself, like of good in itself, being together, like with students like this, that's life. Like that's like a big part of our lives. And like and a big part of students' lives is just like being in community together. And I think of teaching as I think I might be stealing this from Bell Hooks, I can't remember. I think she says something about utopia in teaching, but like the idea that that when we create a community in a classroom, like we're not just we're not just like doing it for some specific purpose beyond the classroom. We're also like being together in community. Like, I don't know how to say it exactly. I'm not sure how to articulate it, but like, I think that the community that we create together is valuable, and it's valuable whether or not students can use that knowledge in a career or in the future or in some job. It's like, here we are in this life together, experiencing the world and one another. Like that should be, we ought to attend to that experience as an experience. I don't know if that makes
No, it
sense.
makes so much sense, especially in philosophy. If there is any area of knowledge that it's so the point of not being useful for other things, it's just that thing itself. And I'm thinking about games themselves as well, right? I mean, why do we play games? Because it's fun, because we want to have an experience, and it's a nice experience. And I completely agree. So I had a question here, but I think you had addressed it already. Because in like classic philosophical undergrad courses and everywhere, no? Argumentation is what matters the most. It's like, oh, you need to learn how to argument. And well, in critical thinking with the argumentation maps, I can see how you can teach argumentation with that kind of like playing around with the arguments like a game. But in Dungeons and Dragons, do you think this also applies or not? Do you think they can also learn like the argumentation philosophical process playing Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. And I think like in particular, like, we think about like argumentation and philosophy, but it's also so there's like writing an argument, but really I think the deeper thing that I think I want to get at in teaching students about arguments is really thinking about reasons and justification, and thinking about like having reasons for things that you do, or reflecting on your own reasons, or being responsive when other people provide reasons. So I think like there's the sort of formal process of analyzing or evaluating an argument, but then there's the way that like argumentation is like embedded in our lives, just as human beings, or reason giving is like embedded in our lives as human beings. And so I think like, to me, that's the bigger goal of teaching about arguments, is that like more sort of practical embedded, especially for me. I teach at a community college. Like I'm not teaching, every once in a while I might have a student that goes on to major in philosophy, but like we don't have majors here. Most of my students are one-time gen ed students. And so I think like the goal for me is about, thinking about, especially in ethics, like why do you do what you do? Like how can these ethical frameworks help you to think through decisions that you have to make? And I think that that's not like teaching argumentation per se, but like it's related, to the deeper goals for me anyway. And so for the students, when they say, oh, my character does this, and then you say why, I mean, they're giving an argument. So that I think it's very naturally embedded in that.
Yeah, because they are giving a reason, they're thinking about it. And of course, I think we need to think of philosophy way beyond the university, right? I mean, everywhere, right? Basic education, but even beyond basic education. Everyone, at least I feel this way. I feel philosophy is very valuable for everyone.
Yeah.
So I have this question about like, which is related, so which is like beyond learning, and because related to that argumentation, why philosophy is writing an essay. Does it have to be to write an essay? You said about your mentor there that let's do a drawing, let's do something else. What do you think personally? What do you think? Like, can we do philosophy by playing games, or maybe designing a game? Like in your case, I would be interested in a game you could design that's like a tabletop RPG that's philosophical.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. I mean, because I think obviously, defining what philosophy is complicated and everything, but I think like what I mean, so in terms of designing a game, I think like I think it's useful to have students design a game. So one thing I've done too is like, you can have I actually borrowed this idea from Stephen Block Schulman, my teaching mentor I mentioned before, that we did this when we were co-teaching a class once, where we had students, we thought about, think about the game of Monopoly, the game of life, like, and then you can take that and you can say, what are the values? What is this game saying about what life is, or what the goals of life is, or what the good life is? And then like, okay, what if Aristotle were designing the game of life? What would that game look like? What would the goals be? What would be the win conditions? What would be the obstacles? Like, so I think that like you can think about games, as I don't know if you know like T. Nguyen's book, Games, Agency as Art.
Yeah, I love that book. It's what
Yeah,
got me into. I started channel because of
yeah. So and I think what he talks about is like the ways that games like shape our agency. I mean, I think like then clearly, I mean, if he's right, and it seems like he's right to me, I think he's right, then games are deeply philosophical in that sense. And that designing a game means thinking about human agency and values, and how we would represent that. So to me, like, yes, like it's like I think that games can be very philosophical, and that designing games, both instructors designing games but also having students think about designing games, can be a really cool way to draw that out.
Have you done that? Getting students to design games?
A little bit. Like I did it as like a in-class activity in groups, where we did it with Aristotle, where they had to come up with like what would be a game of life for Aristotle. And I mean, obviously they can't, if you really wanted them to design a game, it would be like a full semester long project. So I had them more just like sketch out a sort of like, what would it mean to win the game of life according to Aristotle? What do you think would be the sort of obstacles or challenges along the way? So it was more of a kind of a sketch of an idea of what a game would look like than having them fully develop a game. But it is something that I think would be really fun and could be an activity that you could use for a bunch of different philosophers. I did I did a conference presentation at the teaching hub, I think at the AP. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I had people pick a medium. So it was like sculpture, drawing, comic books, and game design was one of them. And then we rolled dice, and they got like they got a philosophical text and a medium, and they had to put them together. And so the group that got game design had Gettier. And so then they were like making up a game for Gettier problems. And it was really interesting. And it was just sort of a random mashup. But I think you could do that with a lot of things. Like, what would it mean to make a game of, I don't know, the categorical imperatives? We keep using
but this is really nice. I even thought I'm going to start doing this in my free time. I'm going to start getting all these games, change for these philosophers, because it's just fun to do these things and play with those theories. This is really
Yeah.
nice. Because of talking about Dungeons and Dragons, there is this classic character alignment of morality. You have the chaotic, lawful axis, and you have like the good and evil axis. So since you're using Dungeons and Dragons to teach ethics, I imagine that this is something that might, to me, it feels shallow when it comes to, okay, it's very famous, we do memes about it, but still, when it comes to ethics, like what is good, right? I mean, what are those things? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I actually started doing my own alignment system on the character creation sheet. So I, instead of doing lawful and chaotic and good and evil, I have, what do? I do uh context depend, like I can't remember the words I use, like whether ethics is more contextual or more universal, and then whether we should be more concerned about the agent or the outcome. So those are my two axes. And then so when they're creating their character, they have to think through like where would Beauvoir be? And that's actually complicated, and that discussion is really interesting to think about, what like where they would fall. So there's not, like, I tell them, sometimes there's a clear right answer, of what alignment, what the alignment of the philosopher would be, but sometimes it's an interesting discussion to kind of think through, like exactly where on that. So I do a different I have like a 2-axis alignment system, but I used to do the traditional one, and then I started adopting this new set of axes. And I think I had a tweet about it, and then I had all these people suggesting all these other dimensions of possible, theories. And so you could even, I think it would be interesting to think about, multi-dimensional sort of alignment system. But I just use the two axes.
Oh, that is great. That too that you said, I already thought you can put so much in there. You can put like from care ethics, you can put so many things in there, and it's simple for the students, right? If you put too many axes, then things might get a bit confused there. Or you can play with different axes depending on the circumstances. And then again, like the axes themselves, they are already philosophy, right? They're already saying that, like, okay, so ethics can be mapped with this X, let's say that, or let's say these many axes. Yeah, these things are super interesting. The blog text it was fantastic. I loved reading that one.
Thank you.
I thought that you got the idea from the Dungeons and Dragons from that reacting to the past, which are you familiar with reacting to the past? Have you used it?
I know of it for sure. I've never had the chance to play. I've been wanting to for a long time, and I haven't done it. I want to try to like organize a game at my college so we can try it out. Because I'm part of I have a teaching with games community of practice, and we've actually been talking about wanting to use the Reacting to the Past game. So I'm familiar. I know of it. It seems wonderful, but I haven't specifically used it myself.
Yeah, I will interview Shoshana. She has used, because I was thinking, oh, that's interesting because it's a project that got really big. And I felt like, okay, it's interesting to know, and also know the negative aspects, the positive aspects. But Dungeons and Dragons, for me, it was mind blowing. Do you have anything else you'd like to say?
I don't think so. Just like, I hope that people will I think people should experiment more in their teaching. And I think people should just go for it. If you have an idea, just go for it. I feel like that, sometimes we're so scared to try new things. And I think what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's not like we're being that successful anyway, right? Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you very, very much. And thank you for your text and doing these experiments. For me, it was really nice to see these things. And I'm finishing a PhD in philosophy. And I feel those ideas, they excite me to play with them, like to try them myself on my free time, because they are just nice. It's just nice. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. This was really fun.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Rebecca. And when I publish the video and everything, I will let you know. But it will be soon. It will be soon.
Okay, cool.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Bye.
Sounds good. All right, it was so much fun. Bye.
Bye.